Police have arrested more than 180 people for lighting bushfires across Australia since the start of 2019. Arson has been one of the key issues discussed this fire season as a contributor to the loss of life and destruction of thousands of homes.
Joining us live now is Daniel Lewkovitz, security expert and CEO of Calamity Monitoring. Let's start, Daniel, because people get angry. They want to point the finger. They want to find out who's to blame, particularly with such a horrific, devastating episode we've seen the past few months.
Well, most people over the age of 30 will know that we've had bushfires as long as this country has existed. But I think passions are so high, or hot, if you will, over the recent bushfires. And one of the interesting phenomena I've seen is that everyone now has an opinion on everything from rural fire management to climate change to what caused the fires and so forth, devoid of any facts. So it's actually become quite an emotional issue that's moving us away from facts, because people are looking for answers to the problem, and there are not always answers to difficult problems.
That's right, and there are so many factors as well. It's not just one thing that has been causing these bushfires. It's a number of things that we're certainly looking at and researching. But getting back to arson, should the deliberate lighting of bushfires be considered environmental terrorism?
Well, this is one of the challenges that law enforcement and the judiciary in general are facing, because fires get caused by a number of things. There can be, accidental fires, there can be environmental factors, lightning, so forth. But in respect to the several hundred people that were arrested, I think it's fair to say that a number of those were not necessarily malevolent or malicious. They were just stupid. It could be something like a ciggy butt thrown out the window. However, there is certainly a smaller subset of that was well and truly arson. It was the deliberate attempt to actually light a fire with a view to creating a fire. Now, when you actually light a fire, there's a flow on from that, which is, well, what was the person trying to achieve? Because as tragic as bushfires can be, and particularly for animals and wildlife, I feel there would be a difference between, say, lighting a fire that's going to take out trees and grassland and so forth versus the deliberate attempt to affect humanity. But at the same time, once a fire is lit and it gets out of control, that can sometimes happen. So a person who may have just wanted to see fire, see a paddock go up, even do some land clearing, next thing that fire gets out of control, it's actually destroying homes, it's potentially leading to fatalities. So the intent needs to be measured, but in many cases these are bad actors who've got a very significant problem. And I think a lot of that's being ignored because there are people who, for political reasons, want to avoid talking about arson because they have other reasons for thinking that these fires happen. And I think to do that in isolation is a good way of ignoring a problem that is going to recur unless we find effective ways of dealing with it.
Therein lies the grey area, isn't it? Because you don't know who's lighting these fires. It's not like a petrol station or a supermarket or a restaurant. You can't have CCTV on national parks. It's so hard to find where it starts. And then it's so hard to define what happens next.
Well, the other thing is that of the, say, 180 people who've been arrested, and certainly the subset of that were committed well and truly arson, that tells me that there are a lot more people who simply weren't caught because they got away with it, because, as you correctly say, you can't have surveillance everywhere and you can't see everyone who's coming and going. So there's obviously a real problem here, and it's probably bigger than what's being reported, either through a combination of police and law enforcement just simply not knowing who the perpetrators are, or a discussion that's sort of steering us away from arson.
Do you think the discussion needs to be increased penalties, like we've just heard in Queensland that they're looking at proposing an $11,000 fine for people who do throw their ciggy butts out the window, and also 10 points? So, tougher penalties on, as you said, people who are not perhaps deliberately trying to light fires but are doing stupid things.
Well, one of the things that I found interesting is obviously environmentalists now have a lot of sort of political views that are relating to fires, but for me, cigarette butts out the window, whether they're lit or extinguished or in an urban area or in a rural area, have always been one of the biggest forms of littering. So this might be the agenda that actually, gets the ashtray put back in the car and gets people to stop throwing it out. But I think also one of the other factors that has all but been overlooked is the use of fire and arson to to spread what we would normally regard as terrorism. In 2000,
because that is an interesting point, isn't it? Because we had conspiracy theories from the landing of the moon to the shooting of JFK. There are people out there that think that there is an organisation that is actually holding the country to hostage at times.
Well, I mean, this is not a conspiracy theory; it's a verifiable fact. In 2008. One of the ISIS magazines, Rumiyah, and another one which translates to Inspire, actually published calls for what they regarded as fire jihad. Now, using fire as a form of violence is not a new phenomenon. Most people would be familiar with Molotov cocktails, for example, and a lot of this material, and these were online magazines, they're very well produced, they were spread worldwide, as well as encouraging people to light fires, also had instructions and guidebooks on how to create an ember bomb, which in essence was a device with a timer on it that after a certain time period would actually ignite, so that this could be left somewhere. And as far as prevention of terrorism and looking for suspicious activity goes, whereas a person, for example, going into a hardware store and buying tons of ammonium nitrate fertiliser might find themselves being added to a list or being watched, a person going into a petrol station and buying a few hundred litres of gasoline is not going to raise any alarms. Now, if we think about the timing of that, 2008 seems like a long time ago, but that was followed by the Victorian fires, which happened very shortly after. The other thing that I found interesting is that the question of fire jihad, which is a global problem. Thousands and thousands of acres in Israel, for example, have been burned by the deliberate sending of incendiary weapons over the border. They come over on kites, on balloons. It's a very easy attack vector. Now, we in the West, I suppose, have the advantage of a 10-year head start on terror methods. If we look at, say, vehicle ramming attacks or stabbing attacks, those were happening 10, 12 years ago in the Middle East, and people tend to ignore it, and then all of a sudden you've got it on your doorstep. But in respect to, are we looking at that discussion, when these recent fires were happening, there were, certain groups that were getting particularly excited about it, and within the sort of security, law enforcement, terrorism professional communities that I operate, there were discussions going around, and the 2008 article that was printed in the Melbourne Age, which reported exactly what happened, and it said that this was the report from the perpetrators: fires cause economic damage and pollution, tie up security agencies and can take months to extinguish, so this terror will haunt them for an extended period of time. That was fairly prescient considering what Australians have gone through. And a couple of weeks ago, for some reason, Fairfax disappeared that article and took it completely off their website, which to me seems like a very cynical way of affecting the conversation that we're now having, even though these were threats that were very clearly made. And this is something that law enforcement and the greater public need to be keeping an eye out for, because anybody who's been watching the damage of the current fires would be thinking this is a really good way to cost billions of dollars to strike fear into people's hearts. And that's before you imagine fire moving into an urban area and look at the potential catastrophe there.
Yeah, it would be foolhardy to think everything isn't on the agenda, because that's the world we live in. Everything has to be on the agenda. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for your insight, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.